Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience. It's been a while, hasn't it? Good, good, good. All right, so we're here with MJC 101, the 16th of February. We plan to be back on regular schedule from here on out. I want to apologize for the last couple weeks. I hope you guys have been able to acclimate okay.
I'm glad that you're better.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, my oxygen levels were low enough for a long enough of a time that my family felt like it was in the best interest to go to the hospital. So I spent one night at the hospital till they could get my oxygen up. But yeah, it's no joke. This pestilence that we're dealing with. Um, but I'm very glad to be back. My breathing is much better, and I plan to finish out strongly. Let's see here. But yeah, you guys please be careful. It's I know you're younger and by and large healthier, but yeah, it's no joke. So let's see here. I have one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine, including myself, makes 10. All right. Um, Claire, if you don't mind, Claire, could you verbally tell me or type in your last name, hon? Thank you. Got it. Okay, so moving in, are there any questions, you guys? You guys do okay through the first test? Any questions you have? Hopefully you saw my recordings.
Are you gonna go over them like that each time, or
Yes, yeah, I actually do plan to by way of video or Zoom, I do plan to go through the tests. Yeah.
thank you?
No, no problem. Yeah, the tests are they're very subjective. You know, we each, well, most of us instructors write our own, and so as far as what's important to each of us, how we want to frame our questions, it's very subjective, and so I feel like I owe that to you guys, to let you see what's coming, and you guys getting the hang of these, and also, yeah, be on account, not to make excuses, but on account of poor health, I've not been keeping up with grading up till now, and I plan to jump back into that, obviously, with both feet. And so, you guys feel okay as far as what's expected of you on these argumentative assignments? Okay. Yeah, I've only done a couple in each of the classes. Thank you for replying. But honestly, I don't have to say this. You guys are very intelligent, making points that I didn't even intend to convey sometimes in some of these sections, and I'm like, wow, that was very intelligent. That's a very good point. Uh, I never cease to be impressed by you guys with these assignments, and so that makes me very happy. It makes me very proud, even though I personally have nothing to do with it, with your education up to this level and your intelligence. It still makes me feel proud as your instructor. Um, so that's great, you guys. So if there aren't any other questions, we'll just go ahead and move right into the assignment, if that's all right. Oh, so Grace. Do I have two on there, hun? Does it say two?
On like the assignment page, it
Mm-hmm.
says one, but then in the actual document, it says two. So I wasn't
Oh,
sure.
okay. Okay. Shoot. Yeah, what I'm going to go ahead and do then is I'm going to stick with one still at this point, and I'm going to try to trade that out as soon as I get done with this meeting, and switch that on the page itself. Yeah, it's because from semester to semester I change my mind, and I think okay they could do a second one this week, especially like perhaps like during the summer semester, etc. I think okay I think they could handle a second one by now. Um, but yeah, in light of COVID and everything and my absence and all that, I don't feel that. I'm not feeling that this semester. I feel like you guys could continue to take your time. Certainly that you could handle two, you could handle all of them. But yeah, so I just ask that go ahead and just do one again this semester, this week. But I'm glad you asked that though, because I'll try to make that very clear on an announcement. But usually by the time of like the Antebellum West, I usually will finally ask you guys to do a second one. So that won't be out of the question. That very well may happen. But yeah, not yet. You guys go ahead and just choose one of your choosing. Okay. Um, so yeah, so with the titles of these, have you guys done them yet? Have you found any of them interesting? Have you chosen one that anyone would like to talk about before we dive into it?
I've read all of them so far.
Good, good, good. Are you leaning toward one as far as analysis and evaluation?
Yeah, they didn't make George Washington out to be a nice guy, that's by far.
No, they didn't, did they?
I
No,
went to
they.
Mount Vernon one time, and everybody thought that he was such a great guy and all this stuff, and out Mount Vernon, everybody was making him to be a hero. But in this, it makes him seem like he was all for himself.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And so if you want, we could start with that one. That's what I believe number three. Yeah, that's Joseph Ellis, Ellis, and he's a pretty popular biographer of the founding fathers. And absolutely, his book is it's pretty revisionist, isn't it? It revises the court history that praises the founding fathers and says how wonderful they were and how exceptional they were, and it conveys a much more cynical view. So no, you're absolutely right, Jaden. Joseph Ellis on number three, his intention was rather revisionist. It was rather to convey the fact that hey, there's this was a typical man. This was a typical self-centered, ambitious man who had his own designs, had his own ambitions, and it was when those ambitions were thwarted that he joined the rebel cause. And really on number three, I find that kind of lacking that I didn't include more information on his somewhat of his transition, if you will, from being seemingly fine with the British administration and the world in which he lived to progressively becoming more rebellious as these rebuffs, if you will, kept happening to him, right? So the main areas that you see where he's rebuffed is in his military career, right? And so notice with Joseph Ellis, he paints an interesting picture of kind of a juxtaposition of Washington being a bit insecure, right? And desirous of trying to prove himself and having a bit of an inferiority complex in this British system, knowing that he wasn't, a Cutler or one of the big family names coming from the Virginia aristocracy, right? But also having a sense of kind of arrogance, and entitlement, and believing that he deserved, that he belonged on in the upper echelon of English society, right? And so there you see that kind of juxtaposition. And so he was very proud of his military prowess, of his courage in battle. Um, he was proud of the fact that he had become a surveyor of lands, and felt like he'd become rather adept at that. He was proud of being a cash crop farmer and what he grew, and what he was capable of making money wise as far as selling his commodities from his farm, right? And so notice, right, is that which I probably didn't address that well on number three, but it's like Washington is living between two worlds, right? One world, your status is ascribed, it's handed to you, it's given to you, depending on what your family name is, what your connections are, where you come from, right? And then another part, increasingly in that world that they're living in, is earned, is merited, right? Based upon what you're capable of doing. And so I try to balance that on number three, and I'm not sure how well I did that from his book, but in saying, right, that this Washington was not above playing the political game. He tried to marry up, right, with a woman he married. Some even make the accusations that he wasn't romantically ever even in love with her, with Martha Custis, but it was more of a political grab, if you will, marrying her, marrying up. Um, he he um, he read uh, he read books on English proper etiquette, on how you speak and how you interact, and having proper manners and showing good class and good upbringing, and how you interact with others. He was willing and able to play that game, if you will, right? To try to curry favor with the British authorities. So he was not above, for lack of a better way of putting it, brown nosing and trying to, to kiss up, making it up the system. But he especially, right, according to Joseph Ellis, he especially thought he was worthy of making it up in that system, because it was as if the English system were straddling those two worlds. The old world, in which your status was ascribed to you by the British system, and this new burgeoning world that was coming up, in which you earned your way, that you earned your stripes, right? By your capacity, whatever field you were in, how adept, how skillful, how hard you worked, etc. Right? And like I said, especially when it came to the fields of the military and raising his own farm products, George Washington was very almost entitled, according to Joseph Ellis, where he felt like he knew he was amongst the best, and he deserved to rise up and to be recognized by the British. And so when that did not happen, especially in the military, right? When that did not happen, that's supposedly when it ruffled his feathers, when he became restive, when he became, discontent, and thereby joined the rebellion. So would he have joined the rebellion? Ellis kind of leaves that question floating in his book. Would he have joined the rebellion had his ambitions been had they materialized? Had the British accepted him with warm welcomed arms and allowed him to rise up the military hierarchy, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And again, I think as emblematic of him believing that he was in this straddled world where you halfway earned your lot and he halfway, quote, deserved it, was the story of Braddock, right? That I tried to include on number three, is that, that was his superior, but he felt like Braddock got the job that should have been his, right? And Braddock gets killed in the attack on Fort Duquesne, and he not lionizes, he does the opposite. He totally I can't think of the verb. I'm sorry, guys. My brain is not functioning yet. But the opposite of praises, right? He totally just makes it the reputation of Braddock scurrilous. He says this guy was an idiot. He had no tactical genius. He didn't know what he was doing. He walked us right into a trap. And basically, the idiot deserved to have been killed in that attack. And thank God for me that I helped salvage the day, right? From a complete fiasco to somewhat of a stalemate by the end of the battle. And if they had only put me in control of that battle, uh, we would have we would have avoided that fiasco. So wow, right? As far as that sense of entitlement, but notice, right? It's not a sense of entitlement on account of him being married to Augustus, to him being a distant relative to one of the Randolphs. Nothing of that sort, right? It's the fact that he felt he deserved it, he earned it, he was capable, he was one of the best, right? And to that extent, uh, like I said, as far as the balancing act of this book by Ellis, is George Washington does believe he's living in a kind of a new world, a world in which people ought to earn and deserve their way to the top, right? And so notice that balance. And on number three, is yes, on the one hand, you have a very like Jaden said, a very self-centered, selfishly ambitious man in the form of George Washington, who, had he only had his ambitions met, may have actually helped repel the rebellion instead of lead it, right? Had he had what his selfish desires entailed. um, but you also have a man who believed that we were progressively living in a world in North America in which the best, the most capable, those who deserved or earned their stripes, right, should be given the positions. And so hence, right, when you find the elements to the Enlightenment and to other ideological forces behind, supposedly behind the revolution, right, that those forces made sense to Washington also. You know what I mean? So I could almost picture him after reading Ellis's book, halfway defending himself and saying, well, yes, of course I deserve Braddock's position. I was more intelligent of a leader than he was. Of course I should have been able to farm, to merchandise my own products from my farm, because those middlemen were making poor economic decisions and losing me money and trying to trade, right, with the trading houses of London and Liverpool, etc. Um, of course, also other Americans deserve to rise up the economic, bureaucracy, deserve to head west and settle on the land, etc. Because this is progressively a land of opportunity and merit, what people earn or deserve, right? What they work for and clearly deserve. So it's something to think about, um, as far as this thesis. So to me, it's me personally, it's um, it's somewhat mildly revisionist. Joseph Ellis's book, right? Where yes, you definitely, as Jaden said, have a very selfish, ambitious side to George Washington, but you also, like I said, you have that rhetoric that is consistent with the rhetoric that was espoused during the Revolution, right? And that is that we're progressively in a world in which people ought to earn or deserve their rise, their success, their position, etc. Right? And that I could picture George Washington saying, well, hey, it's not just for me. I'm not just fighting over my own selfish grievances. I'm fighting for a system that's fair for everybody, right? Where everyone who earns or deserves the position ought to be given it. All right. So good, good. And then as far as any questions?
Yeah. So George Washington, when he after he's president, everybody wanted him to be like king basically, and when he gave
Uh-huh.
up his position, so would you basically coincide with that? He was kind of for himself, or that he was more of kind of wanting to give up things? What's your kind of thought on
Oh,
that?
that's a great question. That's a great question. I think all of us so often are a product of nature and nurture, and I think as far as Washington, he's no exception. That as far as his nature, his personality, like I said, to me, I think Ellis captured it well. He was a very curious combination of an ambitious, almost insecure man, but somehow somehow paradoxically very, very arrogant and very, very self-assured. And so I think that he was also a product of his time, and that time was a curious combination of years and years and centuries of deference, right? Remember, deference is knowing your place. Some people are just born better bred, like a dog or a horse, right? And so some families ought to be looked up to more naturally and deferentially because of their better breeding from the past, which of course does not goes against everything we believe in as Americans today, right? Because we're much more egalitarian. Everyone's on equal footing. It's all about what you do with your free will, your talents, and everything as you live your life, right? But he came from a different era in which, you know, for most of his young life, deference was the norm, right? You looked up to certain families, certain families and names were conceded to be better than others, right? And so I definitely don't think he was an egalitarian as far as today's standards and so forth. But I think there was just enough in his time period from the 1760s through the 1780s. There was just enough propaganda and rhetoric going around, right? About earning your lot, about having about America being a special place of opportunity for everyone. And as long as you earned it or deserved it, then that was fair and right, right? And I think that just further um, allowed him to sleep better at night with people deferring to him, right? Because knowing that, hey, well, I've earned it. I was a great military leader, and of course that's argumentative, right? If you look into his military history, he lost a lot more battles than he won. But still, you have that kind of sense of entitlement that he had earned his stripes, that he was amongst the best, a natural leader for people to look up to. And just, you can't say enough also about the coincidence of the timing, about us losing for so long during the War for Independence, and his constancy of personality. He definitely had a resolve that seemed to have been out of the ordinary, that was anomalous. The Valley Forge incident, right, and all that. Um, you know, guerra is war in Spanish, right? So guerrilla is little warfare in Spanish. We had to fight guerrilla warfare, right? Guerrilla. We had to fight little warfare because we could not take the British on toe to toe. When you read your basic military histories, it was kind of like a Rocky movie. We got our bottoms kicked for most of the war, and it was just ended up being a war of attrition. We just outlasted the British. A lot of people, I've heard it rather intelligently likened to Vietnam, how we were on the other side of that in Vietnam, how we won most of the battles in Vietnam, and but the Vietnamese just kept fighting guerrilla warfare and would not give up, and we finally gave up, and they didn't. And so going back to George Washington, is there was a time in which people were allowing the misfortunes of war to really dissipate our hope and our expectations of winning. And Washington had that personality, that buoyant personality that stayed afloat and said, no, we're going to see this through. That stoicism of his, whereby I think that was much more important in hindsight than his military genius as far as his contribution to winning the war. Um, but so, yeah, I think it's just a combination of a lot of things, just me personally. I think that he grew up long enough, because he was in his mid 40s during the War for Independence. And so he lived long enough in the old world, in a world of deference, where he was able to convince himself, right, that especially with the British getting kicked out, that he would be amongst the best that was left, right, connected to that British system. And then he lived just long enough, however, to also, he was born just recently enough to experience the Enlightenment and the rhetoric of the Revolution, to convince himself that he was in a new world, also straddling this new world where he earned it, and he was one of the best, and he was one of the most capable, etc. And so, yeah, I think it was a combination of nature and nurture, the world that he lived in, that he was convinced that, hey, yeah, we've formed a new society here, one in which leadership is earned, and I'm one of the few who deserve it. I have those special qualities, right? That Americans need to look up to. Kind of, going back to that John Smith one on Jamestown, right, where he supposedly earned his stripes with his natural leadership abilities and so forth. Never mind the fact that he could be very ruthless and the other facets to it, right? So, yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, Jaden. I hope I did as best I could. But it's fascinating. The more I read, the more biographies I read on Washington and others at this time period, just the more complex it all looks. It's not black and white.
Thank you.
No, thank you. All right, and so speaking of calling it a revolution, right? Remember, a revolution, like in Spanish, where it says like "give it a revolution," right? And on a box or something, a crate. Um, a revolution is a 180-degree turn. It's turning everything socially, as far as culture and what's considered, highly esteemed and what isn't. Politically, what type of economic or political system or government and who's running it, right? And economically, what type of economic system you have and who has what allocation of the resources. All three of those, for something to be revolutionary, ought to take a 180-degree turn. So technically, right, by that definition, a revolution is difficult to have. And people are usually pretty stingy with that term. Oftentimes they'll use it, as you guys probably know, in modern history, almost solely with the Russian Revolution of 1917 and 18, and with the French Revolution of 1793, right? So people are usually pretty stingy with that term. And so keep that in mind when you look at Bernard Bailyn, Bailyn. Okay, so on your notes, make sure for test number 2, you're familiar with Bernard Bailyn, Bailyn. And notice the name of his book, The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. That says a lot already, right? So he's already saying that we had a revolution, and that's argumentative. Okay. And then the origins, right? The foundations, the beginnings of our revolution, he's claiming were ideological. So clearly, right, Bernard Bailyn is a court historian, Court, right? Remember, court historians, they praise our winners. They claim how exceptional and special they were. They claim how exceptional and special our country is, right? And so Bernard Bailyn, this is definitely court history, where he's contending, right, that we are a special country, that we were a special country born on special ideas, on special beliefs, right? And that's very argumentative, clearly, right? Because first of all, how do you measure that, right? How do you even begin to measure that? And so you have to quantify things, right? You have to make them, quantifiable, that you can count. And so, for instance, we had 38 newspapers throughout the colonies at the time of the War for Independence, and they look at the population of that time period. They look at the reading percentage of the public, of how many people were basically literate, and they look at how many newspapers were sold, right? And supposedly it's a pretty high percentage, that supposedly, relative to how many Americans there were, relative to how many Americans could read, that a large percentage of Americans were reading pamphlets and newspapers and magazines and many books, right? And they were reading this stuff at this time period, during the 1760s and 1770s. And remember, everything really kind of blows up in the 1760s. at the end of the French and Indian War. At that time, right, the British kind of did somewhat of a lockdown on us. When they had won the French and Indian War, they were 13 billion shillings in debt at the end of the war, and they wanted to reorganize the American territory of North America. They wanted to make it more profitable to get their money back from this expensive war, right? And then, arguably, progressively throughout the parliamentary elections, you had more Tories who were elected into office, Tories, and the Tories, by and large, in their platform, felt like Americans needed to be put in their place. They were more conservative when it came to Americans and our rights. They felt like we were a bit spoiled, and that we needed to pay our fair share of the empire, right? As far as our responsibilities as British subjects. When they looked at the cost benefit analysis, right? And saw how they had protected us from the French, and that was argumentative, right? But you could argumentatively say that prior to the French Revolution, that American subjects would have had more rights and more opportunities under the British than we had under the French. And so hence again that it was to our benefit to be under the British flag as opposed to being under the French one. Um, and so that when they looked and saw how little we paid in taxes, how little we paid as far as any kind of form of a draft to fight for the British Army, that we weren't pulling our weight, that we were getting exceedingly economic opportunities to trade, access to land, and being penalized or having to carry a very small burden in return. And so, hence, at the end of the French and Indian War, when the British began taxing us without our colonial assembly's permission, right? Remember, 9 out of the 13 colonies were royal. Um, and so that was a royally handpicked governor. The governor, in turn, would handpick his royal council. And then there would be an assembly of an elected legislators, right, of the lower house. And so 9 of the 13 had that form of government. And it had become throughout the 16 and 1700s, it had become commonplace that the assemblies were giving their permission to tax us, right? That had become common custom. And so at the end of the French and Indian War, the British were like, okay, where does it say that in the British Constitution? Under English common law, where does it state that we have to be granted permission by the colonial assemblies to tax them? And that was definitely an ambiguity, an area that was unclear. Because when you look under English common law, it goes by precedent, it goes by past laws and judicial decisions, right? And legislative decisions. And nothing had been definitively set by Parliament as far as who taxes us and as far as sovereignty. And remember, sovereignty is, where does authority rest? Where does it originate from? Right? Who gives the ultimate permission to tax us, to give laws that we have to abide by, et cetera, et cetera. And it's that ambiguity, it's that unclearness that helped lead to the War for Independence, right? Because there was no definitive answer that was satisfactory to both sides. Okay, so during that time, you would have progressively one colony after another that would make a law establishing sovereignty in the assembly. So, for instance, I think it was like Maryland. They Someone was accused of smuggling, and the Maryland legislator promised the governor that they would not allow this person to go unpunished, these smugglers to go unpunished, but that they would try these smugglers right there in Maryland, right? And so sure enough, they decided on the guilt of these smugglers. But who decided upon the guilt? The assembly, the legislator, the elected legislator of Maryland. So thereby they claimed under English common law, because everything goes by precedent or by tradition and history, right? That they had established that right then and there in that year in the 1600s, that from there on out, any case involving criminal activity of smuggling would be tried by the legislator itself, not by the British authorities, right? But when Benjamin Franklin years later brought that to Parliament and said, okay, in this year Maryland established this precedent, and in that year Massachusetts established another precedent, right? Where taxes were granted and by the legislator, by the elected legislator. The members of especially the Tory party of Parliament said, well, so what? Okay, well, when you look at each colonial establishment, it was a case by case basis. Virginia was granted by James the First. Charles II granted the Carolinas. They each had their own stipulations in the colonial charters, right? And according to English common law, it's on a case by case basis. So that did not satisfy the Tories back in England when we gave that argument, when Benjamin Franklin represented that organic argument, right? Like a living, growing plant or tree, right? Saying, hey, we organically, by English common law, established this precedent here in this year, this precedent there in that year, et cetera, et cetera. That was not satisfactory to the British Tories. So they said, no, it's a case by case basis. And they went a step further than that, right? As they said, well, because it's ambiguous and because it's case by case, this has just led to conflict and disagreement. So we're going to definitively set the tone now, hundreds of years later, in the 1760s. And they established the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act stated, right, that in case it's not clear, that in all the colonies, Parliament is sovereign. Parliament represents the colonies, whether they want to be represented by Parliament or not. And Parliament decides, right, on taxing them, on what rights they have or don't have, et cetera, et cetera. So the Declaratory Act was huge, right, as far as getting the colonists in an uproar, in a state of uproar, saying, whoa, wait a minute, that's not how English common law is meant to be carried out, right? That is supposed to be organic, like a living organism, and it's case by case basis. And so, at any rate, at this time in the 1760s, is you have people like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, James Otis, John Dickinson, who began getting the printing press, right, all organized and finding stuff from the Enlightenment of the 1740s. And the Enlightenment, right, happens in the 1740s. And just like the name implies, as they imply that we are beginning to live under a new era, a new dawn, a new time period in which our eyes are proverbially being opened to realities. So, for instance, when you look at a guy named Rousseau, Rousseu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and in the beginning of his book called The Social Contract, he says, man was born free, yet everywhere he is ironically in chains, right? So Rousseau and these other philosophers of the Enlightenment, they write and say, we have a different idea. We believe that it is apparent to the human brain, right, by inductive and deductive reasoning, that it's self-apparent. We all ought to be aware of it through common logic, that the natural state of man is to live in freedom, right? that we were meant to be born free. And so at the foundation of the Enlightenment is called deism, Deism. And deism, right, is this notion that God is like a great clockmaker. He made everything according to natural laws. And then he kind of sits back and allows everything to, he allows the ball to bounce, if you will, and everything to operate according to those natural laws that he implemented in the universe. So you have natural laws when it comes to, the physiological realm, laws of gravity, laws of orbiting and around the sun, right? And Kepler's, uh, orbit, uh, laws of orbiting around the sun, etc. That everything happens by a natural scientific law that was brought about by the creator. Well, just as there are physiological laws, there are moral and political and philosophical laws that were meant to be put into effect also, right? And one of those, coming from Rousseau, is that people are meant to live in freedom. Okay. Then you have a guy named John Locke, right? Locke, and his second treatise on government. And he writes and says, well, I believe that nature and God have created politics. They've intended government to be in a state in which we are to have our life, our liberty, and our property protected by government and guaranteed by government, right? And so that idea, again, like Rousseau, of the social contract. So the idea is, right, is that imagine if like a Lord of the Flies type incident, if we as a class engaged on a trip and we somehow became marooned on an island, and we devolved back into a state of anarchy, of no government at all, right? And people started having their stuff stolen from one another. People began kind of extorting one another, right? Saying, catch me some fish or hunt me some food or else I'm going to harm you, right? So taking away our liberty. And then, of course, people might, to the extreme, began attacking one another and threatening our very survival. So the idea is that we say, you know what, we're going to go back to the state of nature, the way the creator intended everything, and we're going to guarantee everyone's life, liberty, and property by democratically electing a body among us here in the class, right? We're gonna by popular sovereignty, by the will of the majority, we're gonna elect, right, this governing council, the security council, if you will, and they're not to be our masters. They're to be our servants, right? And they are to protect our lives, liberty, and property while we're here on this island. Okay. So going back to the original intention, the original cosmic intention of government is to preserve our liberty and to protect our life, our liberty. Um, that's okay, Joanna. Thank you for asking that. I understand. Thank you for asking.
Bye.
Bye. Hon. Okay. Um, so at any rate, um, going back to the Enlightenment, right? That's the idea, is that in a natural state of things, we are meant to be as free as possible, as free as the government can keep us, right? And the government is our elected servant, not our master, and is to protect our life, liberty, and property, what we declare to be our natural or inalienable, which cannot be and should never be alienated from us, our natural rights that we're entitled to by nature, by God, right? Because a civil right is what the government gives you, the government can take away, right? So the Enlightenment was all about natural rights, rights that you are entitled to, okay? But notice how convenient all this sounds, right? If you want to break free from England, if you want to optimize how many rights you have, You want to optimize how democratic you want your own colony to be. If you want to optimize how many liberties and opportunities that you as an individual ought to be able to exercise, all this sounds very convenient, right? And that's where I'm becoming more cynical. That's where Howard Zinn comes in his history, and saying that this is all very convenient propaganda, right? To optimize our own freedom, to lift the yoke of England, of Great Britain, off of us. That this is all very convenient sounding rhetoric, right? That we're contending, that we're fighting for, but not according to Bernard Bailyn, right? Going back to Bernard Bailyn, these beliefs fundamentally shifted our paradigm, the way we looked at the world, the way we looked at England, the way we looked at our relationship with England. That this was sincere, according to Bernard Bailyn in his book, right? That this represented a shift in how we saw ourselves, how we saw what we were entitled to and not entitled to, right? And what we claimed that we were fighting for, right? And that we as a special country were not born on ambition, on a mere desire for resources and power, right? But that we progressively began to believe in these beliefs that were circulating at the time of the revolution, and that we progressively began to believe we were fighting for a special country, a country that was conceived in liberty, conceived in natural rights, right? Conceived in this notion that we were meant to be born free and as independent as our actions would allow us to be, right? So that's Bernard Bailyn's thesis, is that these ideas percolate through the printing press, and that we genuinely adhered to them. We believed in them. We believed in this as a higher purpose for our war for independence against Britain, that we were going to safeguard for future generations this new higher bar for humanity, that we were going to live by principles of freedom, of liberty, of the government being our servant, not our master, and of our entitlement to certain rights and privileges, right? As human beings, not just as Americans, right? Because the Enlightenment was meant to be universally applied to all human beings. And so it wasn't just the Enlightenment. You also, according to Bernard Bailyn, had the Great Awakening. And the Great Awakening, right, as an idea, basically to me was conditional deference, right? Know your place, obey the church authorities as long as they are following God. But the moment that they cease to follow God, that they cease to become a righteous exemplar for others to follow, then you have the God-given right to rebel against them. No problem, Omar. He asked us, right? What do I mean as far as uh, how far our actions will allow us to be, right? And that the idea is, right, is later on it was encapsulated by classical liberalism in the 1800s. If you wanted to look at an example of that, look up a guy named John Stuart Mill, Mill. But what they contend, right, is, okay, when the Enlightenment talks about freedom, how free, right? How free are we allowed to be? And the idea is, right, is that you, um, what's the expression? Grant me just a second here. Um, your freedom to swing your fist ends where my nose begins, right? You can do whatever you want in exercising your freedom until you metaphorically punch me. Then your freedom to swing your fist, you've exceeded your allotment of freedom. And you stepped and infringed upon my freedom as a fellow citizen, right? And so that's the notion with the Enlightenment and these notions of natural rights, is that you are entitled to to live out your life, to have your own decisions, your own behavior, until you infringe upon the natural rights of someone else. So when you become tyrannical over someone else and you infringe upon his or her freedoms, then the government must step in and have regulations, have limitations to what your freedoms ought to entail. And I think about on a much lighter level, right? I think about, for instance, like I remember way back in the years of the 90s in college, etc., whereby someone is enjoying his or her right to play obnoxiously loud music in his or her dorm room, right? But someone else has a test the next morning and that person can't sleep. And so you have this dorm resident advisor, right, or resident director, who has to come in and make the decision. Okay, well, we had to balance this. You can play whatever music you want, but this person next to you has a right to sleep tonight and to prepare for his or her test tomorrow morning. And so there has to be that balance, right? That balance of optimizing your individual freedom without it infringing upon my freedom as your neighbor. And so that's what I meant, right, with the enlightenment and being as free as possible to enjoy your freedoms, right? Is that with the Enlightenment, they were all about you being able to, like for instance, the Scottish Enlightenment, because most of the Enlightenment was French. The Scottish Enlightenment part of it was very libertarian. Remember, libertarian is government don't tread on me. Government stay as small and minimally involved in my personal life as possible, right? So with the idea of the Scottish Enlightenment, uh, I ought to be free to carry a gun and protect my own family and protect my own property. And the government, big brother, needs to stay away and not physically threaten my abode, my personal abode, right? But if me carrying my gun, I end up becoming a menace to someone else's personal safety, then Big Brother needs to come in and regulate my carrying of arms, right? And so that's the notion there, is that is the Enlightenment was meant to be as libertarian as possible. Government stay out of people's personal lives, let them optimally make their own decisions and enjoy as much freedom as they can carry out and enjoy without becoming a menace to someone else's freedoms and infringing upon their neighbor's freedoms, right? So I hope, Omar, that I answered your question. That's what I meant by that expression. Okay, no problem. So so like I said, you have the Enlightenment, and it was all about natural rights, what people are entitled to. It was all about the social contract. Remember, like the idea of us being on an island and we decide popularly who's going to rule, and they're going to be our servants and not our masters, and they're going to protect those natural rights, right? That's all integral to the Enlightenment. When they got into natural rights, you have people like Voltaire, who wrote about freedom of conscience and the freedom to complain about the government and voice your concerns and voice your personal convictions, even at the point of offending other people. Voltaire was all about that. You have Beccaria. Beccaria was all about the rights of being a suspect, right? And if you're accused of a certain crime, having basically your due process rights, right? Of being able informed of what you're being accused of, being able to defend yourself in court, being able the right to be presumed to be innocent until it's been proven that you're guilty. Beccaria was all about that. Um, you have as far as natural rights, I'm trying to think. I know as soon as I'm done, I'll think of a few others. Uh, yeah, gosh. So moving on from natural rights, you have notions of checks and balances in the Enlightenment, right? Montesquieu was huge. Montesquieu. Montesquieu was all about having checks and balances in government, right? And so that there's not one faction or group of individuals that prevails tyrannically over everybody else. but that everyone has checks on one another, and there's a sense of balance, right, in government, and who has power and who has a say in determining policy in government. And so to this day, right, the idea of having a legislative, executive, and judicial branch that balance one another out, the idea of different factions, a group that has the same self-interest and does the same thing for a living, having no single faction prevail over any other factions, that's all Montesquieu to this day, that supposedly our founding fathers were influenced by. Um, Goodness, what else? So those were all big parts to the Enlightenment, right? Like I said, the Great Awakening was all about um, righteous rebellion. That if your leaders, particularly your church leaders, are in defiance of God's laws, of His higher laws of humanity, then you have the right to rebel against them, and sleep well at night as a Christian, and knowing that that's okay. Because right, there's a very precarious balance in the history of Christianity. There has been a lot in the 2,000 years of the Christian church, right? There's been a lot preached about obedience to authority, but there is some wiggle room, right? When you look at the Old and New Testament of the Bible, there is some wiggle room whereby, right, where the early Christian leaders like Peter and Paul were told by the Roman authorities, don't preach the gospel anymore. And they said, no, we're sorry, but if we must either obey God or man, we're going to obey God rather than man. And we're going to preach the gospel in defiance of Rome. And so the same thing here with the Great Awakening is you had groups of preachers and religious leaders who joined the rebellion and said that England has with the Declaratory Act and these taxes and other acts that go against English tradition and go against the Enlightenment and notions of natural rights, right? That England has overstepped her bounds, and that you as a Christian have the right to, in free conscience, rebel against England and even take up a gun and fight against them in battle, right? And that God will bless your rebellion. And so you have the Great Awakening. You also had the classics of Greece and Rome. And basically, right, well, a lot with the classics was the notion that that freedom is to be earned, right? That Rome deserved her republic when the leaders were righteous, when they allowed the tribunes, the elected representatives of the Roman people, to do their job and to lead the Roman people. But when Rome became immoral, when the Gracchus brothers and others kind of just abused the power of the people, and when the Roman emperors began to disregard the tribunes and the Senate for that matter, right, and to lead as tyrants, then they lost that right. They lost that right of having a free republic, and that it was the obligation of the Roman people to take up arms against tyranny. And so, for instance, right, with Julius Caesar, right, fighting the Gauls in France, and then he turns his army against his own political rivals back in Rome and abusing that military power. People likened George III of England to Julius Caesar, right? Or to these different, Neros and Caligulas and these other emperors who had become tyrants. And so there were a lot of that kind of simple polarization between a tyrannical emperor and the freedom-loving regular Roman people who wanted a republic, right? Who wanted a representative government through the tribunes. That rhetoric you find in a lot of these writings in this book. Um, and so, for instance, when people were writing against England, right? Let me end with this example from this book. Is there were two guys named Gordon and Trenchard, Trenchard, and then Gordon, Gordon, and they had a newspaper called Cato's Letters, Cato apostrophe S. And in Cato's letters, right, Cato represented a desire for a representative republican Rome against a tyrannical emperor, right? And so in Cato's letters, they liken the fall of Rome, right, to what was going on before their very eyes under George III. George III progressively was buying people in Parliament, basically bribing them and buying their alliances. There was a guy named John Wilkes who was saying that the Parliament was progressively becoming a puppet to King George III and his Tory party. And when he was elected by his borough or his district, George III said he could not sit in Parliament because of his opposition to George III. And that went right into the hands of Cato's letters, these writers, right? And said, look, guys, this is happening. What happened to Rome and the fall of Rome and her liberties and her republican form of government and her elected tribunes, right, fell to these tyrannical, whimsical, selfish, power hungry emperors. George III has become that emperor, right? And not allowing oppositional people to sit in parliament and buying his opposition and shutting up and trying to crack down upon those over in the English colonies, right? Who are demanding their natural rights, who are demanding their rights to be represented by their assemblies and not by Parliament. Because remember, we didn't have anybody sitting in Parliament for us. We never elected anybody into Parliament. We never had that right. So the fact that Parliament through the Declaratory Act was saying, we decide your fate, right? To a lot of Americans now progressively who are reading these pamphlets and all this stuff about the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening and classic Greece and Rome, they are progressively getting scared and saying, wow, George III and the Tory party are taking us backward. We're going backward, right? Because remember, English common law was to be organic. It was to grow as time goes, right? And the idea was is our liberties were supposed to be enhanced through time, right? We're to be giving more and more opportunities and powers and privileges as time passes, not fewer and fewer. And so Cato's letters, supposedly, you guys, were huge. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Dickinson, John Adams, they were printing Cato's letters back in England and disseminating them here in the colonies and telling us, colonists, awaken, open your eyes. George III is a tyrant and he's taking our rights away. And he's taken us on a backward trail, right? And making Parliament and his Tory party the rulers over us. Okay. So that's all court history. That's what we learned as kids. And really, subjectively, as your instructor, I think there's enough to it that there's a reason why it has lasted to this day, that there is some truth to it, but there is some truth to it, right? Almost nothing is that black and white. And so then moving on to the other two, I'm going to try to speed this up, you guys. I'm sorry I'm taking so long today. But the other thesis that I want you to remember is the salutary neglect thesis. Okay. SALUTARY, neglect, NEGLECT, that we were neglected, but it had a healthy effect on us, right? The salutary neglect thesis. And to be honest, our textbook adheres to that one. That one is less romantic than Bernard Bailyn's, right? Because to him, he's saying basically that like a child for whom dad had some strict rules, but dad was never around. He was always on business ventures and doing his thing, right? And kind of neglected his child. And the child became self-sufficient during dad's absence. So then dad comes back and the child is your age. The child is, 18, 19 years old. And the dad comes back and says, hey, we're going to carry out these rules. And the son or daughter says, sorry, dad, too little, too late. I've been self-sufficient all these years. You're not suddenly going to tell me what to do. So that's the salutary neglect thesis, and our textbook adheres to that thesis when you read chapter 7 in our textbook, right? So, for instance, the laws about making laws, right? Again, under English common law, it was to be organic. It was to go as everything just grows like a living plant or organism. Everything was to just organically happen. So different colonies received different rights from one another, right? But they began establishing one precedent after another, whereby they decided to tax themselves through the colonial assembly, whereby their colonial assemblies and local judges decided on who was guilty of smuggling or who wasn't, right? And so that they began acquiring these independent these powers, right? Then economically, there were navigation acts whereby you had to have special papers to trade in a certain commodity, special papers to farm a certain product. They were not enforced, right? According to our textbook, another author is Paul Johnson. Paul Johnson adheres to this thesis also in his American history book, as he looks for evidence and finds evidence that we just did not abide by these laws. We defied them from the very beginning. People did what they wanted. So George Washington, right? He grew commodities on his farm that he did not have papers for, right? But he grew them nevertheless. John Hancock became rich selling merchandise that he didn't have papers to legally sell. And that's why they wanted to crack down on John Hancock as an example for the public, right? People's families, like Benjamin Franklin's, switched um, switched their vocation from generation to generation without official permission, but they did it nevertheless in pursuit of wealth and improving their family status. So then suddenly, when the French and Indian War ends, the Tory party takes control of Parliament and says, okay, guys, now we're going to crack down on you and have some laws, and we're going to carry them out now, right? You have to have legal papers to do what you do for a living. By the way, we're making it clear that Parliament has supremacy over you and taxing you and having the final say over laws, right? And the American population says, sorry, Dad, we're full grown. We've been doing our own thing for too long. We're not going to allow you to tell us what to do at this point. Too little, too late. So under the salutary neglect thesis, which by the way is popular back in England, right, to this day, is a lot of the British kids in their school systems, from what I understand, are taught this thesis about us to this day, is that their American subjects were spoiled brats who defiantly did whatever they wanted from the very get-go, and that we fought to keep a good thing going, not because England was tyrannical over us, but because we did as we pleased from the get-go. And once you have that good thing going, right, you're going to be willing to fight to keep it. That freedom, those opportunities, those powers that we fought to keep a good thing going. All right. So any questions on that, on the salutary neglect thesis? So notice the two realms, right, that they focus on is the political realm, that we did what we wanted politically, and that our assemblies became powerful, even though Parliament didn't recognize it. And economically, we did what we pleased, right? As far as the mercantilist laws of who can do what for a living, etc., that we defied them from the beginning. And we kept to keep those two good things going, right? And then lastly, right, is Howard Zinn's thesis. Howard Zinn looks at this as a Marxist, as in a simple dichotomy between those who controlled the resources and own the resources and those who did not, right? The rich versus the poor. And remember, to a Marxist historian, the poor are the good guys. They're the ones that you empathize with, right? So when he sees this, right, he sees three different classes of people, at least three, rather than two. He sees the British who are in control, right? And then he sees this new separate class of people, like you saw in Joseph Ellis's book, right, with George Washington. He sees this middle class develop of colonial leaders who are selfish, ambitious, defiant, have their own agenda, right, against the British. And then thirdly, he sees the common poor folk amongst the colonists, right? And when he sees this fight going on, he sees it as a manipulative game of the middle class. That these this middling group, right, of colonial assemblymen who were elected as the leaders of the colonial people, who expect, like George Washington, to be accepted in by the British system and have all the same privileges and opportunities and to enrich themselves as their British lords do, right? And when they don't get what they want, right, they look over and happen to see the misery of the common colonial people and they capitalize on it, right? Because to Howard Zinn, the common colonial people, they don't see a difference between the Washingtons and these colonial elites and the British. To them, they're just the same. They're rich parasites who enrich themselves at the expense of the common poor person, right? But to the colonial assemblymen, right, who are supposed to be the elected reps and leaders of the colonial poor people, is they see a chance, right, to use the common colonial person as a soldier to help realize their own selfish ambitions. Because after all, right, you're not going to, very, very cynical thesis, isn't it? It's depressing reading Howard Zinn, to be honest. I personally hope there's not too much truth to this thesis, but I feel it's always it's always good to be as balanced as possible as your instructor, to let you read everything on the spectrum, right? So I feel like he deserves his fair share of attention. Is again, if you're a George Washington, you're not going to go to a common colonial uneducated person and say, you know what, I don't think much of you. I'm worried about myself and my own family. Whatever new American government that I want to implement here, I don't care if you participate in it, and I don't care what opportunities you do or do not have. I'm worried about myself, but I need you to fight for me and maybe even die and bleed on the battlefield for me to kick the British out. So won't you come and fight for me and with me? No, you're not going to say that, right? What you're going to do is you're going to offer what Bernard Bailyn offers in his book, right, as propaganda. Is you're going to say, hey, I'm a lesser evil than the British. Come fight and serve under me. And I promise you that when we kick the British out, you'll have natural rights. You'll have freedoms and opportunities that you don't have today. You'll have a freer, right, and more open society under me if you'll fight with and under me, right? So that's Howard Zinn's thesis, his very cynical thesis, is that the founding fathers were they were interested only in themselves and their own class and their own ambitions. They wanted their own power, and they didn't want to get caught in a rich versus the poor class warfare, right? They didn't want the poor's wrath to be turned toward them. So they used the British as a scapegoat and says, follow me instead, and we'll kick the British out because the British are the source of your misery, not me. And that they promised in return, right, the ideas of the revolution as propaganda, as giving them hope, right? And saying, fight for me, and we'll concede that we'll have opportunities for you here in this new independent country that you didn't have under the British. Anybody have any comments on that, such a cynical thesis? So again, this is called A People's History of the U.S. by Howard Zinn, if you ever wanted to look into it. Very cynical Marxist history. But again, I feel like as an instructor at the college level, that I should at least give, if not credence, at least give a bird's eye view to all these different perspectives, to let you use your own brain and look into it yourselves. Okay, so that's all of the theses that we cover on this one. Okay, so salutary neglect, we were left alone and we fought to keep a good thing going. We were defiant from the get-go, and we fought to keep our opportunities and freedoms, right? Bernard Bailyn is the court history that it was a revolution, that these ideas revolutionized the way we thought about government, right? And that we fought for these lofty principles. And then Joseph Ellis, more revisionist, that the founding fathers had their own agendas and that their own ambitions were thwarted. And that had a lot to do with them joining the rebellion and leading it. And Howard Zinn, a Marxist history, that the founding fathers had their own selfish agenda and that they manipulated the poor, right, to kick the British out, but promised them in return certain minimal things, right, as far as our propaganda, to get them to fight for and with them.
Can you repeat that?
Sure. All of it, or which part of it, Jaden?
The last four people.
So again, you have salutary neglect, which is the textbook and Paul Johnson, that's the British view, right? To this day, is that the British had strict laws, but they were never really strictly enforced, and that we kind of became spoiled independent children under England, and we fought to keep a good thing going when the British tried to crack down on us at the end of the French and Indian War. Then you have Bernard Bailyn, Bailyn, and his is court history, right? On it being a revolution, and that we fought for ideas that were percolating at this time through the printing press, right? And so hence a romantic view of the revolution, that it was a revolution, that we were fighting for principles of the Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, the Great Awakening, Greco and Roman stuff, right? And then you have Howard Zinn, and Howard Zinn is much more cynical, right? He's a Marxist historian. He sees things as far as rich versus poor, and that the founding fathers never truly had the best interest of the poor common Americans at heart, but they had their own selfish agenda, and they tried to manipulate the common people, right, to fight with and for them by using propaganda and promising a better country with rights and opportunities, right, if they were to help them fight and kick the British out. All right, does that help?
So what about Ellis?
And then Ellis, right, is revisionist. He's not court. He doesn't praise the founding fathers, right? He's revisionist. He revises that romantic view and says, right, that and focuses upon the thwarted personal ambitions of the founding fathers, right? And stating that their ambitions, because their ambitions were personally thwarted or stopped, that's largely why they joined and led the rebellion, for selfish reasons. But remember, in fairness, I think Ellis's book is mildly revisionist, because I think I could picture George Washington in that book defending himself, right? and saying, well, I'm not just mad against the system for myself only. I'm mad for all Americans, that there ought to be a system that's open to whoever earns or deserves the positions, right? And I tell you what, I'm also going to note, you guys, because I went so long and it's been a while with COVID and everything. I'm going to add 7 points instead of just 5 to your scores this time. Okay.
Thank you.
No, you guys have earned it. Sticking with me here. So yeah, look for 7 extra points on your War for Independence assignment. You guys have definitely earned it. We've been going for almost an hour and a half. Okay, so any last minute comments or questions?
You sound a lot better now.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, my oxygen levels are higher. I feel like I'm out of the woods now. Yeah, sorry it took me so long. I had kind of pre lung issues, and so I should have known that that COVID was going to hit me a little extra hard. But yeah, you guys, please stay safe. It's no joke. It's pretty brutal on your lungs. All right. So any last minute questions, comments? All right. I'm proud of you guys. All right. So 7 extra credit points. I'm delighted to feel better and to be back and to see you guys weekly. I really am. I'm looking forward to this, and I'll try to get back into grading. Okay. All right. So thank you guys. It's been genuinely nice to see you. Okay. All right. Take care. Thank you.
See you next
Thank you.
week.